uppercut, try to hit me in the gut, thinking that I won't react. You whispering my name, thinking I won't be the same. Turn fiction into fact. See what you didn't know, bruises that I'll never show, slipping on your every jab. So tighten up your fist, step into the ring with this. I hope your mama's got your back. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, pulling the sound of my name in the crowd. You hit a buzz. Oh, 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 oh. You hit a buzz. Oh, 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 oh. Just 'cause I took a break, you're making a huge mistake, thinking you can take the throne. Look at you trembling, step into the lion's den. Bet you wish you stayed at home. Begging for mercy underneath your breath when I ain't even sweating yet. My legend's written in the stone, yeah. You're crying age in defeat is now your...
Photo of you in my mind, on the table under lights. There's no one here but you and I. This neon town is yours and mine. And I said, hey, 𝐂𝐚𝐥𝐿. Stayed up through the days and night, late and we watched the world get light. Hey, 𝐂𝐚𝐥𝐿. Sunlight, freedom in your eyes. Please don't leave now.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to After Dark. My name is Nick. Thank you all so much for joining us. With me today is Andering, Dr. 𝐂𝐚𝐥𝐥, and Commander McMillan. Gentlemen, all welcome. Thank you so much for coming.
Glad to be here.
I'm contractually obligated to be here, so don't even go on with this. Thanks so much for showing up.
Yeah, well, you could do the polite thing and be like, "Well, gee, Nick, it's a thrill as always to be here." Like you can. That's why we're bringing
live?
Seth.
Oh, hey, this is awesome. Yeah, thanks so much for
Throwing his credibility into the toilet right from the start.
Oh wow! Okay, yeah, we're bringing Seth Andrews back, and he's going to be. He's going to need to. He's going to have a little talk with the co-host. All right, dear Lord. Welcome, everyone, to After Dark. Thank you so much for coming to my nightmare. I wish I wasn't here anymore, but thank you all for joining us. So, as always, you guys can call in. We're not actually going to open up the call lines for probably at least 45 minutes here because I really want to take this opportunity. We've got Dr. John 𝐂𝐚𝐥, who has been on repeatedly. Our regular viewers know him. He has been doing our philosophy series, Introduction to Philosophy. We cover a... all right, thank you, Titan. We cover a different aspect of philosophy, bring him on, and he's been helping us out with that, and it's been marvelous. We've also, regular viewers know, Commander McMillan, who has been helping us out with all things military, but in particular, we've had some need for him recently when covering what's been going on in Ukraine. And there's a lot to cover. Things of Russia is starting its second major offensive, or its first major offensive, or its first military operation or its second. I have no idea. We'll figure it out. We're going to talk about it tomorrow. But for now, tonight, generations theory has been something that Dr. 𝐂𝐚𝐥𝐥 has been interested in for a very long time, and he asked if we could pass some of the stuff on to Commander McMillan, and lo and behold, Commander McMillan was very familiar with it and was had read that stuff as well. So this is not my field of expertise. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand things over really to Dr. 𝐂𝐚𝐥𝐥 and to Commander McMillan and let them hash it out. And we're going to let them talk about it for, like, as I said, about 45 minutes. Then the call lines will be open. You can call in, and number is in the description. Number is in the title. I'll give you out the number around that time as well. You can also live.intimeshow.com come and join the hangout. But like I said, first 45 minutes, I'd really like to let these guys sort of talk on their own. If people come in, want to talk, want to ask questions, great. If not, we'll let them keep going, and we'll see how far that takes us. So with that said, Dr. 𝐂𝐚𝐥𝐥, you are up.
Oh, well, okay. Thanks a lot. Folks familiar with the show within time might remember seeing me, what have we done? Maybe one or two shows in the past year about generations theory. And talking about generations is fun. But the main topic tonight is the math behind generations. In other words, what makes it real, as opposed to just speculative pop culture. And there's nothing wrong with pop culture studies. There are discernible differences among generations, and this is no surprise, least of all to sociologists who run all the demographic studies and the quantitative and qualitative studies into, every 20 to 25 years, the gestalt, the sort of zeitgeist, if you will, the sense of the times changes, and each generation sort of reacts accordingly. A younger generation advancing it, an older generation maybe resisting it, one caught in the middle, kind of not knowing what to do with it, and a sort of midlife crisis. And these sorts of sociological observations have been around forever about other countries besides America as well. But tonight what we wanted to talk about was something that isn't just sort of pop social psychology, as respectably academic as that can be, but specifically generations theory, which in the hands of its two authors, Howe and Strauss, and their well-known book, Generations, 1991, it was published now over 30 years ago. They made a lot of predictions from their vantage point in the early 90s that turned out to come true. And in fact, if you rummage through their pretty thick book, Generations, they make easily maybe 3 or 4 dozen kind of specific predictions about life, what life in America would be like, culturally, socially, politically, in sort of the next 30 to 40 years. I've kept track. I've been an enthusiast of the book ever since it first came out, and of course, had a front row seat to actual American history, checking off the items. And lo and behold, every single prediction that they bothered to make that was interesting to them enough to make a prediction about in their book has come true. It's been valid, verified, fact-checked. By who? Well, by the national newspapers chronicling, by the national magazines, by the national pundits as we went through the 90s, as we went through the 2Ks and then the teens, right? These confirmations are just so. It hasn't been generation theorists confirming it. It's been American journalists and historians as we roll along. One major prediction made in 1990, like a big one, real big one, has come true. It just came true with the election of Biden. They predicted in 1991 that no member of the silent generation would attain the White House, or if one did, there would probably only be one. In other words, the silent generation born between 1925 and 1942 would have the weakest grip on not just the White House, but also on important other positions like Senate Majority Leader or Chief Justice of the United States. And to make that claim in 1991, now you have to remember the average age of a silent generation, you know, like Biden, he was 50. I mean, so not even 50. He was really becoming a powerful senator at that time. So to take a look at the most powerful generation then and say they would end up, by historical standards, being the weakest generation, it stood out. I mean, to predict politics like that, that's something. And indeed, Biden will go down in history as the only member of his generation to attain the White House. And the silent generation will never have a Chief Justice on the Supreme Court. There have only been a couple of even prominent congressional officers. Nancy Pelosi is a silent, and she is Majority Leader of the House. But there have been very few silent that have ever. And that was an interesting one to watch, because you had to wait 30 years, and there won't be another silent after Biden. He'll either get reelected or he won't, or I suppose he won't run. Logically, there are some alternatives. One other major prediction on that scale, having to wait 30 years, was made by generations theory. They predicted that in the early 2020s, there would be a major secular crisis, either toppling the home government or involving the United States in another world war. And from 30 points vantage out, they couldn't tell you which one, or indeed they said it could be a combination of the two. And the reason why they said that is because they're looking back in history at a pattern. And there is a pattern. And they looked back about 400 years to see a pattern of these kinds of major secular crises. Now, let me explain this terminology. It doesn't mean big war. There's lots of big wars. There's big wars every decade all over the place. A major secular crisis is major in the sense that dramatically large casualties, both uniformed and civilian, huge cost in terms of damage, destruction, mayhem, and of course, money, affecting the homeland. These aren't foreign wars. These are things that existentially threaten or existentially happen on the homeland, where the future of the existence of the country is in some doubt. So that's what they mean by a sort of crisis war, as opposed to just a big war. Secular, just in its ordinary meaning, as opposed to religious wars. Religious wars can happen at any time. America so far has gotten hasn't had a religious war, but of course, if you look back to European history, there are examples of religious wars. They tend not to be as expensive or costly, although quite disruptive. So secular in the sense that this is about politics rather than fanaticism. And then it is going to, in some sense, be the most memorable war of the century. It's going to be the one that every generation that goes through it, whether in childhood or in elderhood, is going to say, yeah, that was the war. Contrast, for example, World War I versus World War II. Calamitous, but from America's perspective, World War II was the major secular crisis, not World War I. World War I, of course, had significant casualties, but it barely ranks in the top 8 of most casualties that America has been, especially per capita. It doesn't rank very high. It only lasted a little while, and it was regarded as a foreign war, and rightly so. World War II, very different for reasons I need not go into. World War, a war of the 20th century. Why the early 2020s? Well, they're doing a count. They're taking roughly 80 to 85 years from the start of the previous war in order to predict the start of the next one. And Nick is going to put up a chart showing that this cycle of approximately 80 years not only goes back 400 years, but I've done the math. It goes back 1,400 years. And feel free to put up that chart. There it is. Hope everybody can see it. So this is my chart of military history. What are my criteria? These are start and end dates of these secular crisis wars. This is not a list of major wars. Any historian, certainly any military historian, can go through this and say, well, yeah, those were pretty disruptive, costly. Yeah, I get the casualties. Yeah, the homeland. But I could tell you 16 more wars off the top of my head in the middle of them that were pretty big too. No argument. No argument. But again, we're not looking for big wars here. We're looking for wars that are relevant to predicting the future. To say in the future there's going to be a big war, that's not an interesting prediction. That's like predicting the sunrise. What we're looking for is periodicity. That means the same specific sort of war of a severely dramatic nature happening at a regular cyclical time period. And that's what this chart is about. Any historian, once they have those criteria in mind, not just major war, but again, this sort of existential secular crisis war, will look down this list and say, oh, well, right. I mean, the very existence of England was threatened, or, you know, London fell, or, okay, that could have been the French taking over England, or that could have been disintegration into complete anarchy and the loss of territorial integrity and so on and so forth. So these are major wars, and they typically combine political stability in the national capital with entanglement with a foreign power where it's all in. Existential crisis. The future of the entire country is at stake. Any good military historian could indeed sort of fine-tune it. They might say, well, I don't know, with you in that 1213, it actually kind of lasted till 1215. You can adjust these numbers plus or minus a couple of years, and that's fine. I had to do a bit of sort of really, you know, I consulted 200 or 300 books in order to really kind of nail these years. When the wars were subsiding, the existential crisis was over, the political stability was restored, crowns were placed on kings again, and so forth and so on. The point is, even if you say, well, there's an error bar in there, Shook, you're not telling people, and indeed there is. This is history, not astronomy. It's not so precise. But you still get the periodicity. Because even if you add error bars of plus or minus a couple of years on every single one of the numbers on these charts, you still get the intervals of 77 years. In other words, from the start of each major crisis to the start of each next crisis, you're going to get an average of 77 years. And what this means is that we can be even more precise than the authors of the book Generations, 𝐲𝐢 and Strauss. We have 1,400 years of data. We have now a long list of intervals. We can do a mean, and the mean is 77 years. If you only take the last 600 years or so, it's 79 years. If you take the start of America's entry into World War I, of course, 1941, you add 79 years. What number do you get? Well, you get 2024, of course, and you know, your error bar plus or minus a couple of years. So that's why the final line says war 2022 roughly to 2026 would be the peak years. And future historians will say, well, no, it really started more in 2020 when Russia started a cyber war. Or, 2022, it may start in 2024 and not really end to 2028. At any rate, 𝐲𝐢 and Strauss did say in 1991 that the 2020s would be the most crisis decade of the entire 21st century for America. Why World War III? It could have been just another civil war, and America, and of course England before it, has gone through civil wars. The reason why I've always had high confidence that it would be not just a civil war, although looking at society from the Trump years and even till today, one might say we're in a bit of a kind of a civil war now. Why World War III in addition? Well, the deal is that once you understand the military chronology to this cycle, as Howe and Strauss did, you can find it in other countries. And another book of theirs called The Fourth Turning, highly recommended, that they wrote after another decade of collaboration. They pointed out that similar cycles can be found in ancient Greece, ancient Rome. Ancient historians have noticed this. Ancient Chinese historians have said, what's up with this pattern to long centuries of China and so forth. In other words, this has to do with history, not just American history. And if you think about what the planet was like at the end of World War II, how many big countries were involved in World War II? Well, the right answer is, of course, most of them, right, were severely disrupted or actively engaged in some theater or another of World War II, or went through their own local regional revolutions and upheavals of a similarly climactic nature. And what this means now is that the entire planet is on the same clock. The entire planet is on the same clock. That is to say, Russia is now clocking with the same periodicity. China is clocking with the same periodicity, with the same sorts of generations at the helm. And we can turn this around back into generations. But if there is going to be a World War III, you would expect major, not just America, but of course major European powers, Russia, some combination of Russia and or China to be involved. In other words, countries that are on the Security Council of the UN, which was rather the point after World War II. So from a vantage point of 30 years ago, could our authors tell us guaranteed, sure thing, was it going to be World War III? No, and they did not. So they are not falsified, even if World War III doesn't emerge. But something like a civil war, possibly combined with foreign entanglements of a severely expensive nature, seem inevitable for America. Historians, generations from now, will decide whether it was worthy of being called World War III. But everybody can tell that we've been entering into really the globe's most dangerously violent phase, not seen since the days of World War III. Everybody can sense that it feels a lot more like 1938 than 1978.
Yeah, I think that's definitely yeah. Well, and there's certainly the references to the Ukraine. What's happening in Ukraine right now is drawing a large number of parallels to late 1930s. We do have a $10 super chat from Sinister Porpoise. I do want to get to that, so that's we're going to table that for just a little bit. I want Shook to finish his thing, and then I want to make sure we get McMillan involved, and then
Matt says we're doomed.
Matt says it's all over. You heard it here first. This is what our show is for. It certainly isn't the first time we've broadcast the end of the world on this show.
Big wrap up.
Yeah. Well, it's hey, just well, for a show that regularly broadcasts the end of the world, you'd think would have more subscribers, but. All right. So, Commander
wait,
McMillan,
there's more.
Yes. What am I missing?
That's the last.
That's
time we broadcast the end of the world. I was like, yeah, and it gets even worse than that.
That's right. Yeah, I remember. Well, and then the talk about the super EMP weapons and all this. So it's a delightful, if your nightmares aren't bad enough, just watch a couple of select episodes, I think. So, Commander McMillan, now I have heard of this, but I haven't read any of the books. You've read some of these books. What's your take on this?
Kind of echoes Dr. Shook. The one thing I came away with a different impression than what he's saying, and I'm not disagreeing with him. It's just a slightly different orientation. I always felt that the secular crisis that they're predicting did not necessarily have to be a violent war. It could be some sort of political upheaval. And yeah, they're very well, and in many cases, if not most cases, there's violence involved. But I don't think that was a prerequisite to the secular crisis being such. The other one that we're not talking about, because it's the other 40-year cycle, the 40 years off cycle with the secular crisis is a spiritual awakening. So that would firmly put that in, our spiritual awakening was sometime in the 1980s. So, have we decided what that spiritual awakening was? I don't know. And that's another thing that I came away with from reading the books is it's really difficult for people who are proximate to the time these events are occurring to be able to correlate them with the actual cycle. A lot of people will say, oh, this has to be this, but you don't get the long-term 2020 hindsight perspective until it's probably 50 years in the rearview mirror or something.
Forgive my ignorance, because I have not actually read any of these books. I watched the first one on generations theory, and I'm here to learn some more. The very first thing that pops to mind about this is the problem with prophecy. And I keep hearing it's like, well, we can look back and we can see all of these things, and while it's happening right now, we may not necessarily know that we're going through it. And if you look through enough, there's enough things going on in the world that at some point there's going to be enough things that could meet these qualifications that you can look backwards and establish a pattern between just about anything. When you are making predictions to the future, there will be some severe political upheaval, say 77 years in the future that happens somewhere around these years. There's enough of that stuff going on, give or take a decade, that it seems like it's awfully convenient to be able to make predictions like that, because there's several different kinds of things that could fulfill it. I've always had a problem with prophecy because of that. It's like if there's going to be predictions, they need to be, in order for them to be particularly useful, they need to be fairly specific so that you can know when you've actually met that bar. And obviously, if the world were to break out into nuclear war, next year, that would clearly fulfill anybody's expectation of that. But it's like, how do we know if this is actually going to hold true? I mean, I wouldn't call the war in Ukraine and what's going on right now to have fulfilled what you described as a serious threat to our homeland. So what kinds of things would
again, I don't think that was the prediction. It's that there's a crisis, and if arguably you wanted to say that crisis, and I'm not advocating that this is the case, but if you wanted to say the crisis was January 6th, that could arguably be brought up. It was an attempt to overthrow the government by a select group of people internal. It is a secular crisis. That's what they're saying. And you can't say what it is at the time. But when you look back, as with World War II, as with the Civil War, as with the American War for Independence, in each case, everybody, in retrospect, is very much in agreement. Yeah, that was that particular crisis. There's no doubt in anybody's mind that that's what it is. Would you agree, Doctor?
So what?
All right. This I think begs two questions. I want to try to dovetail and maybe frame what I think is Andring is saying all right. One problem in general with prophecy is, and I think this is Andring's objection, and a problem in general. If you're going to have a theory, you'd want it to be predictive. And so the first question is, if we are predicting that sometime between 2022, and I think nobody's saying Ukraine per se is it, might be the match that lights the tinder in the next couple of years. Obviously, it's increasing tensions, but so if I guess what as Andring is trying to say, and as Andring, please correct me if I'm wrong here, but to try to frame this, obviously you would want a theory to be predictive. So if this is going to be predictive, we're trying to say, okay, sometime between 2022 and 2028, somewhere in that window, or 26, we're going to see some kind of major secular crisis. Now, if this is to have any predictive power, you obviously would want to be able to, or if this is to hold up as a theory, you would want to be able to say, okay, we were able to predict that. But if you can only tell going backwards, you run into this problem of prophecy where there's so many things going on. Even if there's a general consensus, you can almost always, try to coax something to fit that theory. So how do you guard against maybe either confirmation bias or wish thinking and saying, well, I already have this theory, so I'm looking for these events. Oh, and I can coax these into it. So is that roughly where you were going, is Andring?
Yeah. And like I said, I did not read the book, so this is a question out of ignorance, but it's anytime we talk about, looking back and seeing patterns through history and that can show us patterns that we can project into the future, it always runs into the problem of prophecy, because there's so many things that happen throughout the world that we can look back with hindsight of all of the events, and we can pick the most prevalent ones and say, yeah, these are the ones that really mattered. And in some cases, like I would argue World War II, there was no doubt while World War II was going on that this was the war of the century. I mean, it was a really, really big deal. So in something like that, I can understand, and maybe we are right now just in the precursor, and they will absolutely be correct. And, again, in a year or two, there may be a World War III going on. I'm just wondering, it just seems like that in order for generations theory to be particularly useful, it would need to have enough predictability to it, so that we would be able to start identifying some of these problems, so that we could say, hey, wait, we need to back up here because we're about to enter, one of these generational upheavals that we should try and stop.
And when
or
anyone...
not, I argue that it shouldn't be stopped, that in fact it should be accelerated. There is a positive message from all of this, precisely another lesson of history. But let me address the theoretical concerns, because we're talking philosophy of science, and I've been known to give opinions about philosophy of science on this show. So the demand is, not only do we want math, we want a formula. Well, we've got it. That we've shown you the raw math. The data says periodicity. You can ignore it. You can say, I don't like it. You can say, I wish history was different. But this is the factual basis. You can't wish it away. There is a periodicity that cries out for explanation. Second, Howe and Strauss have offered a model. In other words, they have postulated large social, cultural, and political forces, moving actors and agents on a society level scale, such as generations, which can be kind of like agents in various sorts of ways, that can be somewhat predicted. Well, this comes to the prediction. And of course, we want precision. But here, we have to keep in mind Aristotle, the crafty guy that invented the very idea of the sciences. He said, do not expect greater precision than the kind of field of study would permit. When you're dealing with vast national level social forces, powers, cultural agents and so forth and so on, you're not going to get the kind of precision that you would expect in astronomy. But nevertheless, we do want to be able to tell the difference between astronomy and astrology, I suppose, right? Astrology would be the idea of, well, you've got a model and some formulas, but your prophecies are vague. So what we want is precision, but no more precision than would be expected from that particular science. And here in the social sciences, there are going to be some big error bars. Nevertheless, they did define, and I just explained exactly that we're not looking for major wars. We're looking for these sorts of existential secular crises where the very sort of political existence of the nation is at stake. That doesn't happen just every decade. It just doesn't. History knows that, and my chart exemplifies that going back in Anglo-American history, 1,400 years. Those are real, with precision, definitions, verifiable, and any military historian would have to say, okay, well, if those are your criteria, that's what you're looking for. Yeah, you found something real. That really is there in history. And where did I get it from? Well, I read military history books. I had to educate myself. Let me give you an example of a precise, not prophecy, a forecast. A forecast. So this is on page 419 if you're following along with scripture. So remember, they wrote this book basically in the late 80s, found a publisher in 1990, got it out in 1991. So these are really predictions they're sort of assembling in their heads in the late 80s. So looking out ahead with the millennials, and they gave the millennials their name. The reason why we call them the millennials is because they got named in this book as the millennials. Why? Because they would come of age during the millennium, the 2000. So they're predicting what millennial youth culture would look like as the millennials went through adolescence and early adulthood. In other words, when they were writing in the late 80s, the oldest millennial was 8 years old. So they're looking ahead to, right, kids that aren't even born yet, in addition to toddlers. The millennial youth culture will be more clean-cut and homogeneous than any seen since that of the circa 1930 GIs, which is their generational counterpart archetype. By the first decade of the 21st century, schools will be at last fully computer-equipped, and the learning logic of students will shift from an MTV-ish parallel thinking, characteristic of 13ers, that's us now, thinking, back to a more logical serial thinking, where boomers and 13ers had once seen computers as a force for individuation. In other words, the personal computer. That's a baby boomer idea, and Xers took advantage of it. Millennials will see computers as a force for social homogenization. Teen peer leaders will express a growing interest in community affairs, a growing enthusiasm for collective action. Under the boom regime of get tough laws, no kidding moral standards, teen pathologies, truancy, substance abuse, crime, suicide, unwed pregnancy will all decline. And they continue on with other specific metrics on these sorts of demographic factors. Now remember, they're writing this in the late 80s. Who are the troubled teens? Well, Xers, and we were troubled indeed. The Xer generation born from 1961 to 1981 was maxing out by any measure, any generation seen in history on every social pathology, from suicide, alcoholism, drug abuse, truancy. I mean, we were rotten kids, and everybody knew it. Every cover, practically, it seemed for a while there, of Time and Newsweek and so forth, was about, you know, what's wrong with our kids. They predicted right in the middle of that 20 to 25 years later, the covers on the newsstands would be about nothing but what is going right with our kids, or if anything was going wrong, that it would be a national scandal and a moral imperative to fix it. There were no great interest was taken in the Xers. We were pretty much raised as nomads, and we're kind of like that today. So one must expect predictions, forecasts within sort of reasonable parameters to the social field. And when you're dealing with a large, complex society, you can only get so much precision. But it is astonishing prediction. In other words, not just a fairly well-crafted prediction that will be measurable objectively, but a surprising prediction, which is another factor taken seriously in philosophy of science. Something that no other model, model of social development or cultural progress would have dared predict. They were virtually alone back then in the late 80s and early 90s, basically saying our kids are going to be all right. So you're right to expect math, right? Then the model, then precision on the metrics. And they did try to do it in this book. And I would encourage you not only to look at Generations, but also The Fourth Turning, their later paperback, which made another series of astonishingly accurate predictions, accurate within sort of what one would expect in demographics and sociology.
All right, so I do want to take this super chat now. This is $10, Sinister Porpoise, and I remember Porpoise raising this objection. I don't remember exactly what had happened, but I remember. So Porpoise had said confusing or I think maybe interchanging data and information. So, for example, or at least the way it's used in informatics, data in informatics is just how we encode information. Information is the meaning humans put into that. So, $10 super chat, Porpoise. Thank you so much for that super chat. If you have anything else that you remember and you wanna add to that, because I think it sounds like you want to get Dr. 𝐓𝐢𝐬𝐿 to address that, and I want to make sure that happens, but I also want to make sure that we get that, because that was a little while ago, and I do remember you bringing it up at the time. But that was, it's not that show was even all that long ago, but I've been sick and we do a lot of shows. I do remember the objection, and it was during the philosophy of science. So, and I don't have that episode up, but I'll get you a minute to if you want to come up with that example. That is an important difference. I don't know if Dr. 𝐓𝐢𝐬𝐿 wants to either address that now or wait until we hear.
It's addressed, quite right.
Okay.
So, for example, the chart of the dates, they're factual in the sense that they are objective. They're not manufactured by human desires of the historian. Historians would converge on agreement. They generally do. That's why military historians talk about various sorts of wars. They really did happen, even if they have fuzzy boundaries, as any large social political events will have. Information, of course, is actionable. So once you find patterns, trends, cycles, periodicities, objective facts now become actionable information. What can we do about this? Well, at the minimum, we can keep an eye out for the pattern predicting, carrying on into the future. And then it may even become more meaningful after that if we seek intervention, amelioration, or duck and cover. Then it becomes highly meaningful for our lives directly. But at any rate, on the scientific front, what we're looking here is objectivity. That is to say, would experts in the relevant disciplines converge on an agreement once you sort of have a lens, you know what you're looking for. The classic analogy, actually, speaking of astronomy as a good scientific precursor to what in effect we're developing here, which is scientific history, is of course scientific astronomy, trying to get it away from astrology. And one of the fellows that did the most to prove that astronomy was going to be truly its own independent science was a guy named Edmund Halley. You might know him for his comet. If you go back and read Halley's original pamphlet, where he demonstrated that he could predict, and in fact rightly predicted, the return of Halley's comet in his lifetime, he only had 3, so to speak, data points going back. He could look back. He was sure about 3 previous appearances of Halley's comet because they were well attested to by European astronomers who kind of knew what they were doing. He could sort of see the pattern go back further back, but there are a lot of comets actually You might say, well, I haven't seen a comet in a while. But, over the centuries, there's a lot of comets that appear in lots of parts of the sky and lots of parts of the world. So he was sort of looking, but he caught on to the periodicity about 76, 77 years for Halley's Comet. And not only could he find the cycle, he had a formula. He said, well, this thing is in an elliptical orbit. Well, how did he know that? Well, he had Kepler and Newton. So the model came together. He knew the physical forces that would require Halley's Comet to return on a regular cycle. What does this have to do with generations theory? Well, we have a model here too, and there are certain large social and political forces that are in some sense sort of pendulum swinging back and forth, returning us now to the secular crisis, what they call the climactic fourth turning at the end of a roughly 80 to 85 year cycle.
All right. So, and Jason Torn is here. Jason, welcome. And this is an After Dark. So what we're going to do is we are going to open this up. I do have a question for Commander McMillan, and then anybody who wants to come in, you can either come on in. It's live.intimeshow.com. Just plug that into any web browser, and you can come on into the show, or you can call us. Hold on one second. The number here is 484 2 in time. That's 484-246-8463. Give us a call or come on in. Again, any web browser, you can come in and hang with us. It's live.intimeshow.com. Now, Commander McMillan, you had said that a CEO had recommended this book to you, and it seemed to really have an impact on you. And you said you spoke about it basically almost every night after that. So what was it that you found so fascinating about it, and what were the parallels that you guys were drawing with this?
I think the first thing that struck me when I read it, it was the first time I'd ever seen someone look at U.S. history from a potentially cyclical viewpoint. Because up until that point, it was always viewed as linear. You know, the Puritans landed and founded Jamestown, and everything moved forward from there. And this is God's plan, and we're all moving forward in this straight line, and nothing will obstruct it. And then to read Generations and see that he's pointing out, no, there are very predictable patterns in all this. And it's, the type of people that are in certain roles at certain times that will help decide which direction each of these emerging crises is. And I don't mean the secular crisis, but all the little smaller crises that each generation has to deal with in its own time. Of, are you just a foot soldier, or are you an officer, or are you the elder statesman who's making the big strategic decisions? Those are going to shape how the crisis plays out based on your perception of the world as part of that particular generation, which I thought was fascinating. And from that, we started discussing, things like, okay, well, why is this crisis that we're dealing with right now like this? And then we'd say, well, it's because these people are in these roles right now, and they're from this generational archetype, and that means they perceive it this way, and certain other people below them are acting on those orders, and they're perceiving those orders meaning something that may not be what is intended by the original person issuing the orders, and so forth. So that was how we found it fascinating, and we'd sit there and just every night almost analyze what was going on during the day.
All right. Well, the lines are open again. It's 484 2 in time. If you want to give us a call, that's 484-246-8463. You can also actually connect through a web client that way if you want to, or you can come in live.intimeshow.com. And in fact, we have joining us right now Jason Torn, who's has been a little while, so let's get him into the room here. and he's I hope he's I think Jason is trying to connect. We'll see what happens, and we'll let him introduce himself when he gets here. We had him come by. Let's see. Let's give him another shot here and see if we can get him in. It's in time, right? So it's probably our fault, but I'm going to blame him, and if I can, I'm going to blame Xander. That's contractual. Well, actually, contractually, it's the first nearest Canadian, but Neil isn't here right now, so. Yeah, well, all right, Jason. And here he comes again. So it seems like he's tried connecting either maybe with a separate client or something. So we're going to try to. There he is, Jason. How are you?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. How are you?
Not too bad. I can't. I guess maybe I can't turn my camera on.
Oh no, your camera's on. No, we were having some issues with the bandwidth, so I killed the feed up. You just see our logo as opposed to actually seeing our feed. I'm hoping that alleviates some of the bandwidth issues. Normally, we don't have to resort to that, but they were complaining of stuttering in the live chat, so I just killed our my feed back to you guys, so you can't see.
Oh,
anything,
gotcha.
You know what I can do? I can turn it on. I can wave hi, but I'm going to leave it off just to kill in case it's contributing to lag. I don't think it's that, but it doesn't hurt to kill the uplink for you guys. Sorry. I always tell that whenever the guests come on, they always see the really shitty version of the show, and they're like, "Why is everything so pixelated?" I was like, "Okay, look, we have enough bandwidth to stream HD to one location. That's going to be YouTube. You get the SD like 480p image." So I was like, I can't read the text. Yeah, you're the guest. It doesn't really matter. I didn't say that, did I? I think I may have actually said. Okay, I said the quiet part aloud. All right. Well, thank you.
I'm so used to seeing my face. I got to see my face when I talk. No, I'm just kidding. It doesn't.
Well, I got to stop doing that. I have another copy of the live stream like right up here, and I keep looking at it. So I'm like, oh wow, who is that handsome devil? But you can see I'm looking over that way instead of at the camera. So I'm a little. Narcissist has a little company this week, I think. All right, so why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, Jason? I know who you are, but let's let our guests know, and then and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, no, great to be on the show. I'm Jason Torn. I'm actually that's my pseudonym, but I am a mathematical modeler. Research scientist at a university on the West Coast. Most of the work that I do is climatologically associated. I do geospatial modeling, climatological modeling with agricultural and health. So I am not. This is certainly not my area of expertise, but I'm very interested in this topic. I don't really know much about this theory, but I was intrigued because I do a lot of modeling, whether it's associated with molecular modeling, biological modeling, mathematical modeling. So when I hear this referred to as a model, I guess it's a conceptual model, but with regards to kind of a predictive capacity, seems somewhat specious in that respect. I'm not sure, but I mean, when I did do some brief research, just kind of looking up this theory, it does seem to have a lot of criticism. I don't know if your guest is it Dr. 𝐂𝐚𝐥𝐥? Yeah. Okay.
Howdy.
Great. Yeah. Hey, nice to meet you. What's your thoughts on the criticism in academia around this theory?
Oh, entirely predictable and helpful. We're looking at the emergence of what I would classify as a proto-science. So proto-sciences, particularly coming out of the social sciences, are always awkward messes in the cradle. And we're in the middle of that with this particular sort of effort to gather together an interdisciplinary field of sort of scientific history. I mean, look at it. Not only do you have to do sort of political history, social history, cultural history, demographic. I mean, it's kind of kludgy right now, and formulas are scarce. So this is, though, a test case. this isn't just history. History is not scientific. History is one of the humanities. It's about making sense of meanings to ourselves. This is scientific history, or what has been called, with a clever label, cliodynamics. Why Clio, C-L-I-O? Because that's the ancient Greek muse of history. Clever. The person who coined it would be a person that would interest you, Jason, because that person is a guy named Peter Turchin, Turchin, who has, over the last 20 years, chimed in not only in agreement with generations theory in broad strokes, has added many refinements, but he doesn't come from intellectual history. He comes from population biology. He comes from ecological modeling and that sort of thing. And he's turning around and applying it to economic spheres, social spheres, cultural spheres. He sees the same cycling, and he views this as an organic phenomenon, not as a mechanical phenomenon, which makes a world of difference in philosophy of science. We're doing really philosophy of social science, which means that what we're doing is we're modeling very large-scale organic processes, not unlike what you would find in population or ecological biology.
But it sounds like that. No, go ahead, Nick. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, well, okay. So I've heard a lot of objections to generations theory, and a number of them are definitely concerns I share. I do want to plant a couple of flags that seem to me to at least make sense, starting from the ground and working up. We know there is such a thing as human psychology, and we know that human beings do act in reasonably predictable ways. Once you understand that psychology, then they're irrational, but within whatever it is that their goals are, they actually act reasonably predictably and within hierarchies of needs and so on and so forth. It also does appear that we know what a generation is, and we know that generations tend to be influenced by the generation in particular that came before them. And so what I found most compelling when I first really started to learn about this theory is it does make sense to me that you would be able to predict, with enough research, what maybe the next generation would be like if you start to understand how they might oscillate from one or the other. This idea that in essence there's actually four and that you're kind of oscillating back and forth between these four was I thought an interesting concept. And that doesn't strike me as necessarily far-fetched, because if we have a psychology that's reasonably predictable and understandable, and when you get into Jungian archetypes and these things that sort of we all intuit in one way or another, it makes sense to me that you might have a larger scale pattern that you could see in society. So for me, that actually seems reasonably intuitive. Whether or not this has accurately predicted that is a good question. I find it fascinating. When Dr. 𝐓𝐢𝐬𝐿 was talking about the millennials, what I did in my head was say, okay, I'm going to imagine my generation. And I'm going to imagine growing up in the 80s, and everything he says, I'm going to say was predicted about them, and let's see what I would think about this theory then. And I laughed my ass off, because I was like, no, nobody can say that about any of the, but it does fit with the millennials that at least I've met. So I'm sitting there going like, okay, so right off the bat, I mean, that's one of the things, what was it, James Randi did that thing where he basically did this, you could read this piece of paper to anybody and they would think you're psychic. Because we know enough about predicting human beings that you could predict and understand, you could get a human being to think you're talking about them. And so you want to be very careful with this kind of theory. So I do think when it comes at least to those generations, that makes a lot of sense. So then the next question is, how far can that predictability go? And I don't want to put words in Dr. 𝐓𝐢𝐬𝐿. Yeah, I do. I want to speak for Dr. 𝐓𝐢𝐬𝐿 because I'm not going to get a PhD, so this is going to be my only chance to actually act like I know what I'm talking about. So this is where the rubber meets the road, which is, can they accurately predict one of these major events coming up? But I think as Andrew's got a great point. I think this is something that you do have a problem with, which is almost cherry picking events after the fact and saying, well, that must fit if I've already got the theory. So at least the first half makes a lot of sense to me, and it seems to me like it's not a huge leap to go from the first half to the second. And I think that's what So have I framed this roughly to everybody? So trying to frame both sort of some objections that I think are absolutely worth considering and discussing, but also why I lend credibility, at least to the foundational aspects of some of what this is talking about. Does that seem fair to everybody so far?
Yeah.
So, so the biggest objection is, and I've heard a number of objections. So first of all, okay, well, you got a lot of years floating, right? You got maybe 2 or 3 years on either side, so that's 4, maybe 8 years either side. Well, gee, you can fit a lot in that period of time, and I think that's true. But I think that also does preclude a good deal. If you take a look at, okay, the last World War and say, can you really? Now, I looked at this list, and one of the problems is I don't know enough about these wars to be able to. So let's put this list back up here. And you guys should all see that internally now. I some of these I recognize, and I say, oh yeah, if you're going to talk about a list of complete upheavals, not just a war, but a complete sort of upheaval of society as we know it, some of these make a lot of sense to me. The others, I don't know well enough to agree or disagree. So, but if this is an accurate list, and if this list is representative of what it appears to be, then this would make a lot of sense to me. And unfortunately, I don't know enough to, again, confirm or refute. Dr. 𝐂𝐚𝐥𝐥 has worked a lot of time on this. So it's interesting. Now, you had said that this was kind of, what was the term you used? Because I think somebody else said it does have a feeling of woo to it. Again, you know, psychology, I know, certainly felt that way when it came out, still does to people of my father's generation who hated the idea of psychology. It's just like, it's all fake and none of it's real. So I don't know. Anyways, that's sort of where I stand on it. Jason, do you have any, how does that deal with this for you? And we also have Sinister has joined us, so I want to make sure that we say hi to Sinister. And give Sinister, but I want to give Jason a quick chance to respond to that, and then Sinister a chance to say anything. Sinister, welcome. Thank you so much for coming. Again, anyone who wants to, somehow it looks like I may have inadvertently disconnected the call line, so I may or may not get that back up. If I don't get that back up anytime soon, you can still web browser live.intimeshow.com. Come and join us if you would like to talk to Commander McMillan, Dr. 𝐂𝐚𝐥𝐥, Jason, Sinister, 𝐒𝐤𝐬𝐬andering. Nobody ever comes to talk to me. That's because I'm a whore. I'm on everyone else's show. So
we love you, Nick.
Thank you, Jason. You see, somebody who knows when I'm fishing for a compliment. I needed a little love, man. Thank you, Jason. All right, so
affirmation.
Exactly.
Oh, we all know that you're fishing for comments.
Yeah, that's. Oh, thank you, which is why you're not. I understand, 𝐒𝐤𝐬andering. I know where I stand. Porpoise, how are you?
You're muted.
Yeah.
Your channel has the best solipsis jokes in the live chat, not to mention jokes about recursion that keep getting told over and over again.
That both true. My solipsist jokes are the best there are. That's the good news about being a solipsist, is when you guys tell great jokes in the live chat, I get to take credit for it.
But yeah, I think Jason Torm has the same problem I do. Doesn't a lot of this just seem to be correlation does not necessarily equal causation? I mean, you can pick wars that happened. I mean, wars happen all the time. If you pick ones that happen every 80 years, and if you could throw up that list again, aren't they like, it's like they're mostly in Europe and the Americas, but...
Well, this is only the American Anglo periodicity. There's one for France. You can calculate, as our authors did, one for ancient Rome, for China. It's not per country per se. The cycle only exists where you have large nations that sort of control their own internal political and cultural life without severe disruption or conquest. So you're only talking the largest nations that manage to have some relatively stable existence for, you know, a few centuries at a time. So this you're not going to find the cycle in Rwanda or Hungary. Those units are too small. And but between England and America, between a fair amount of isolation and a fair amount of just political luck, we have had roughly 1,400 years of relative political independence without having been completely conquered by a nation that doesn't speak the English language. So that's why this periodicity is particularly strong. It's not causation. This is not a mechanistic causal model. This isn't physics. This is sociology, social psychology. So you can't. The wars aren't causing each other.
That's not.
This is organic. In other words, the liver doesn't cause the stomach, and the stomach doesn't cause the intestine. These are large social organisms where the interrelated parts have their sort of metabolic cycles and periodicities to them, if you know where to look. Throw cause out. This isn't inference of cause from correlation. This isn't induction in the narrow sense. It does start inductively by looking for cyclical patterns, but that's not the model. That's not where the model is at. With generations, the model is actually this business of there are 4 repeating archetypal generations, which of course are the living people actually doing all the real work.
So, Porpoise, did you want to clarify that? Oh, did we lose Porpoise? Okay.
I'm still here. It still seems like you could almost throw this pattern up against any just random set of wars.
It turns out you can't. And that's because of what I explained at the very first part of the show. This is an attempt to be scientific history, which means we need fairly formal definitions of the phenomena we're looking for, and that's what's been supplied. And I won't repeat what I said at the outset. This isn't just looking for big wars.
Well, let's repeat it anyway, because
that can be done. That's called chaos.
Hold on, I think Jason wanted to say something.
Well, people come and go, so I every now and then I like to repeat. But if Jason wants to say something, let's have Jason say, and then I'll try to reframe what I think the conditions are, and we can see if that's accurate or not, if I've gleaned it correctly. But Jason, what were we going to say?
I guess I was just going to add maybe a bit to what Senator Porpoise was saying, just trying to understand the model itself. So it seems like that there is a predictive quality to this that, as you were mentioning, I'm wondering, is there any mathematical or statistical components of this model? Like, are you able to actually mathematically assign values to predict for prediction or outcomes, or is it more kind of a conceptual model? And I'm not a sociologist, so I don't know. You said it's not a mechanistic model, but I'm just wondering, can this model be evaluated statistically?
Sure. You know what a species is, right?
Yeah, of course.
Do you know what a generation is?
You mean in your language, or do I know?
No. In scientifically, what is the proper functional definition of a generation for scientific purposes?
Yeah, I think I do.
Yeah, and so do Howe and Strauss. In fact, any definition you can think of came from them. They were the pioneers looking into trying to formally model exactly what would characterize a generation as a relatively discrete unit of ongoing social organism. And they applied the concept of the life cycle. And I can't explain, 4 entire books in an evening.
Yeah,
but
of course.
The concept of a life cycle is you have 4 generations that are on stage in American history at any given time, from youth to elderhood, right, young adulthood and older adulthood, and of roughly 20 to 25 years of duration each. So the total comes out to somewhere about 80 to 85 years, give or take, right, each generation. Now, what defines the start and end of each generation isn't the generation. That would be circular, right? That would be like asking a species to evolve itself. So what instead Howe and Strauss do is that they point out major social and political events define generations and sort of set the tone and atmosphere for what's going to happen to them at each stage of their life going on. Furthermore, each generation is affecting the other living generations in characteristic ways. Elders are guiding values and principles and institutions. Young rising adulthood is, getting families started and householding and entering their careers and so forth. So there are distinctive needs and responsibilities of each generation according to the life cycle. However, as each generation moves through the life cycle, what, for example, baby boomers were like during young adulthood is not what Xers were like during young adulthood. Why not? Because it's not about that particular life stage. There is no such thing as the young adulthood that's the same for everybody. Being a boomer going through young adulthood, idealistic, kicking off the consciousness revolution and the hippie days and so forth and so on. Complete opposite world for what us Xers, I'm in my mid-50s, so people in their 40s and 50s are the Xers. We didn't come of age in the 60s and 70s. We came of age in the chaos of the 80s and 90s. A very different experience of young adulthood with much poorer economic opportunities and social fragmentation going on around us, the highest divorce rates, and so on and so forth. So our young adulthood was not like the baby boomers. Go forward another generation, millennial young adulthood is not like either of the two previous ones. But nevertheless, there are sort of rough demarcations. You kind of know what generation you're in. And once the boundaries are explained to you, you kind of get it. For example, Howe and Strauss writing in 1991, they picked 1961 as the first year of the Xers, the first year that would not be boomers. Why 1961? If you were born in 1961, you knew with certainty you would never be drafted for Vietnam. You were the first cohort in 20 years, certain that you would never have to go to Vietnam. Why? Because by the time 1961, you had 14 or 15 years, the draft was over, Vietnam was over, yada, yada, yada. You never had to worry about the draft. Baby boomers did have to worry about the draft. So there's something about 1961. Well, turn this into a prediction, Shook. Well, sure. Howe and Strauss predicted that if there was a president born in 1961 that ever became president, no one would think that person was a boomer. Did they know Barack Obama was going to get elected? No, they didn't know who Barack Obama was. That's not the point. The point is that sort of placeholder, if there was a president born in 1961, everybody would say, man, more like an Xer. And indeed, everybody agrees. Obama himself knows he's not a baby boomer. He's not really fundamentally like, and never could possibly be, people somewhat older than him. He had always had more in common with people younger than him. He's an Xer. He's kind of on the cusp, so he shares a few traits. Let me give you another example. If you were born in 1981, you're still an Xer. Why 1982? Well, as Howard Strauss pointed out, that was the first year that baby on board stickers appeared across the American landscape in the rear windows of station wagons and minivans. There was suddenly a new collective interest in the welfare of infants and children of the sort that somebody born earlier never experienced. So there are certain sort of generational collective experiences that together shape the social psychology of a generation. And if you want the details, there are 4 books by Howe and Strauss to go through. So I'll stop with those examples.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would just add to this is that as you were talking about it, I was thinking, hey, this is a hypothesis that can be tested, that surveys can be conducted, evaluations can be conducted across generations, and we can look to see if we find significant differences and evaluate that statistically. My hypothesis would be that there's not so much of a difference between generations, and that actual our life cycle has a much more of a association with these changes. So somebody who's 45 years old if I take somebody who's 45 years old of the millennial generation and somebody who was 45 years old in the boomer generation, if I was able to do a survey of somebody at those time periods, I think I would find that they have some very common interests if we addressed confounding variables like where they lived, what their economic status was, what their race was.
At an individual level, no doubt. That's why they call it the life cycle. Howe and Strauss are not doing individual personal psychology.
Well, but I know
they're doing collective social psychology. Trust me, somebody who went through the 70s in their 30s had a very different collective experience of American society and culture than somebody going through the 1990s in their 30s. Completely different atmosphere, gestalt, what it felt like to be a middle-aged person. And if you disagree, you didn't go through the 70s and the 90s. Trust me, those were two very different cultural milieux.
I'm only just saying that as opposed to kind of just looking at anecdotal perspectives. I'm saying
this is not anecdotal. This is exhaustively recorded in endless book libraries are full of books.
I'd love to see
what the 70s were like. I don't know why you would describe this as subjective. Everybody agrees what the 70s was like.
Okay.
I do want to give Jason a chance to finish this thought. We've got a super chat, and I've got one thing I want to dovetail with what Jason's saying. But Jason, I wanted to give you a shot to finish your thought there.
Yeah, no, I'm not. I don't think I'm questioning what you're saying. I'm only saying that, well, maybe I am questioning to some extent, but I understand what the differences between the 70s and the 90s. I'm only saying that I think that that we should be able to analyze this from a very quantitative perspective, and to say, look, anybody who knows anything knows that there's a big difference between somebody that went through the 70s and went through the 90s. Well, while in general, I guess I understand that concept, I think that what you're saying, look, there is a theory that we can structure that has predictive qualities, that we can model out outcomes based on these generational differences. I'm saying I would want to see the
I'll give you another one. It's not in generations. It's
I don't want an anecdote.
Specific one that leapt off the page for me. I don't have that book in front of me, so I can't.
If you have a
but
paper,
they predicted in the late 1990s that 20 years into the future, young adult millennials would have the lowest rate of home ownership seen in a century. Now, where did that come from? Why are they saying that millennials are going to be losers that aren't going to be able to afford homes? Well, it's because they're looking back at the very same patterns. It isn't just about wars. They see these cycles along all major social and demographic trends that you can get some math and some data on. So they looked back at the corresponding generations, the same archetypal. The GI generation had the lowest home ownership yet seen until the millennials. And then if you go back another cycle of generations, so there is a wave of young adult home ownership that has a lot to do with economic opportunity, educational levels, other bigger things. These are big cycles. They nailed it. I just popped out. Looked at another article, and this isn't news to anybody watching the housing market. Millennials for now 10 years since the first cohort entered the mid 20s prime retail market. They still have the lowest recorded home ownership collectively as a generation, and that'll probably last another 10 years.
But
now, if you're saying there isn't a specific prediction, I just gave you one. There are dozens of
I wouldn't call that a specific prediction,
and measurable and verifiable predictions in their books.
But that also could have been predicted using economic data.
And they do. They go back.
Hold on, let me ask a question.
They're not ignoring economic data. They rely on it because there are similar economic cycles that are tied into the social cycles, that are tied into the educational cycles, and these things are repeating patterns going back 400 years.
Historical pattern.
Okay. I have a different question. Has anyone decided to write a computer program to model this? And then
yes, Peter Turchin. You guys need to read Peter Turchin. He is the guru, the master, the mathematical modeler of all of this stuff and much more besides. He similarly is applying his ecological and also economic powers. He's autonomous. In addition to that, so he's sort of the Renaissance guy, and he's got 10 books out that are talking exhaustively about making this scientific. So he's very aware of Howe and Strauss. He respects what they did, but he's trying to take this cliodynamics, sort of interdisciplinary scientific history, to the next level. And he's got a cadre of similar scholars very impressively doing the work that you guys are asking for. So check out Peter Turchin. He pops right up in any Google search. He's our sort of scientific guru. And so we look forward to further big things from that school.
So Porpoise, I think it was going to be a compound question. So yeah, I want to get the second part of what you were going to say there.
Well, obviously, if we can get a computer model and we can test its predictions using it, we can see if it's relevant. Honestly, a lot of it just seems, I don't know. It seems like a lot of grasping at straws to me. Maybe that's because I don't understand it, but it
yeah,
also
the astrologers hated
other...
Edmund Halley's astronomy at first too. Look, if you're not familiar with the math and the science and the modeling of it, it's easy to dismiss it. Nobody expected history to be prophetic. In fact, that's one of the key fallacies. But this isn't history. History is a humanities. You're not supposed to be doing prophecy. This is making history socially scientific.
All right, I want to get Porpoise one more shot. I think Porpoise actually had a thought she was in the middle of. I want to.
Was there part two? Sorry about that.
I want to finish that thought, then I want to get to Jason. Then I had a thought I wanted to do, but yeah, Porpoise.
Well, I think he's overlooking something, and if I understand what Jason Torn said, and I understand he probably doesn't know my background, and it might just be that we're looking at it from a certain angle because, I'm a computer person. I just decided to go back and get my bachelor's degree in computer science. Then I'll probably want to get a master's. So we're probably looking at it from a single mindset. I'm not saying you're wrong. It just seems, just looking at it.
I can't be wrong. It's not my theory. I'm just a philosopher commenting.
Well, we're not saying it's wrong. It just seems, looking at it from like that perspective, it seems like there's a lot of red flags that go up. And I think Jason Torn has a better grasp of how to say this than I do, if he wants to add something.
I don't want to poo-poo the theory so much because I don't know enough about it. But the only thing I would just add is I'm just curious, like, I know you mentioned this Peter Turchin guy. I was just looking at some of his books. But I'm curious, like, if you had to cite one peer-reviewed article that was more mathy related to this, are there like actual published journals or actual published papers in peer-reviewed?
Yes. Throw the name Peter Turchin into Google Scholar. Between multiple co-authors, and various sorts of associated scholars, they have an industry going. And and if you say to yourself, "Well, that's pretty small." Yeah, look, this is a proto-science. It's a very small intellectual movement, and there's lots of headwinds, and there should be. It's hard being a proto-science, and it may never become fully eligible to be an authentic science in any strict sense. It certainly isn't going to become like a hard science. It's going to remain among the social sciences, very interdisciplinary. And, the modeling will continue to get better and better. So after having a look at Peter Turchin's very large CV, he even has a journal where he publishes other folk stuff, all very tightly peer-reviewed. Not surprisingly, it's called Cliodynamics. So check it out and, decide for yourself what they're up to. But this is not, renegade astrologers. This is entering truly scientific phases in this philosopher's estimate. Having looked back at intellectual history myself at other kinds of proto-sciences that straggled and struggled for a century or two before finally being admitted as a fully fledged member among the social sciences, including sociology. after the term sociology was invented, nobody thought it had the least respectability and didn't think it belonged among the sciences. Economics struggled for 100 years. It's kind of still struggling in many ways. The more math it has, that doesn't seem to help. But at any rate, this is sort of what it's like to be a social science. So due skepticism is appreciated as long as you don't impose the standards expected from any of the natural sciences.
So let me ask this, because this is one of the things that I had found more compelling, is when you were talking about specifically the four turns, the four different generations, and how they reacted, A, to authority, B, to sort of their what they viewed as their role as individuals and in societies. There seemed to be in each of the four significantly marked differences, and ones that were able to make what, at least to me, looks like accurate predictions ahead of time of what you'd see in millennials. So since that was the predictions that affected me the most, is that something that you could talk about for a minute?
Sure. Each generation has its characteristic effects on previous generations, over which they have, of course, a measure of social and cultural responsibility. Let's take, for example, the baby boomers. The baby boomers came of age in a post-war boom where their elders were very engaged in, continuing very materialistic driven enterprises, from the economy itself to sort of the war on. No sooner did the GI generation beat the Nazis than to that generation every problem seemed to require another war, the war on drugs, the war on poverty, and so on and so forth. So as the GI generation entered later adulthood, midlife, and then into their 50s and 60s, the boomers came along and found them to be insufferably materialistic and devoid of spirituality, and promptly rebelled against that, and they could afford to. So you got what Ħao and Strauss call a sort of religious crisis, but that's a strong word. It's not a religious, but an awakening. And indeed, in the going back into American history, you always find these sorts of religious or spiritual awakenings sweep the nation right in between the secular crises. Again, two pendulums swinging in time, just sort of in opposite directions. So, of course, the 70s and into the 80s was a time really flourishing of New Age conscious revolution, and as the hippies carried on into their middle years with this sort of spiritual adventure. And you can go back, you can find the missionary awakening of the 1880s and 1890s, the Second Great Awakening that gave us Emerson and Thoreau and Whitman, and of course the First Great Awakening, first only in America. But if you go 80 years before our First Great Awakening, you have the Puritan awakening that affected England, and so on. So you can track these generations, and what is causing them is a rising adulthood generation opposed to the materialism of their war-winning elders and seeking new meanings and new sort of intellectual opportunities rather than just material opportunities. But of course, then that generation allows certain liberties with the generation after it, and you get a sort of nomadic generation every 80 years. That Xers for us, if you go back 80 years, that's the so-called lost generation of Americans born in the 1880s and 1890s. This sort of lost generation is born and raised during the consciousness or religious revivals, when their elders are focused inwards and not so much on their social or children responsibilities. And the children are just sort of allowed to run wild. You can see a similar pattern of that archetype going back in history, and how Strauss charted back again 400 years. What comes after the Xers? Well, what happens is the boomers enter late adulthood. They realize that the Xers are a complete mess, and they decide to do much better. So by the time the last Xer cohort is born, the boomers are now entering into positions of responsibility and power in the major social institutions as they get into their 40s and 50s. I'm, of course, talking about the 80s and 90s. And all of a sudden, immense resources are poured back into protecting infants and children. There's a sudden interest in what's going on in schools and so forth. Rescuing babies out of wells could happen anywhere at any time, but it only reached the nightly news in the 90s and the 2Ks. The millennials were the most overprotected, over-regimented generation seen in this land since the GIs. The GI generation is known as the GIs because the missionary generation hit middle age in the 1920s and 1930s, realized America was a mess and decided to pour all their focused concentration on the generation after the lost generation. We know them as the GI generation, but they were the clean-cut kids being put into Boy Scouts and 4-H clubs invented just for the GI generation, just in time for them. So each generation has its characteristic influences on the preceding generations, again, helping to shape not only the national mood, but what the major institutions are doing or not doing for those generations.
All right. Just as a side note, I don't know if in time or if Nick wants to share them. I actually went to the university's library to look up Peter Turchin. I linked some articles in the chat if you'd like to drop them inside chat.
I will do that.
Yeah,
Thank you. That's
actually,
a good idea. Yeah, thank you.
I was actually reading up on this guy just briefly, and I was looking at some of his papers, of which quite interesting. I don't see any discussions of actual generations theory, but I do see.
Oh, he's not a generations theory guy.
Yeah,
that's not his.
Not his area. Yeah.
He doesn't have an objection against it. He sees the same patterns, but it's not his strength. He's not a cultural pundit.
I actually did find a write-up that he did where he actually addresses directly this generations theory and discusses it in response to structural demographic theory, as well as this cliodynamics theory that you had mentioned. But it seems like he does have some pretty critical things to say about the generations theory, that it's not a scientific theory, that he doesn't, it has a lot of differences between the structural demographics theory. Then he talks about the lumpiness of structural demographics theory. So it's quite interesting. We don't have enough time to go through it here, but it's an interesting idea. I'm not going to immediately, side against it. So I'm going to actually take a look at it. So
well, he's a mathematical modeler, and Howe and Strauss weren't, but they're looking at the same range of phenomena, and Turchin doesn't dispute that. He likes to analyze it differently. One of the major differences is in generations, because they're experts on cultural history, they really make the generations feel like they're in the driver's seat. That you have these 4 archetypes, and they're the major machines. Turchin sort of takes a convex and makes it concave. It's all the same information, but he would rather have the structural stuff drive the generational differences than the other way around. Now, of course, the right answer is this is organic. They're both simultaneously co-causing each other. It's not like a machine where you could take out the engine and still have something you could call a car. They're both simultaneously co-causing each other, which means what you need is a fully developed ecological theory. These are living systems in effect. And so I think Turchin is saying exactly what he should be saying. This is an inevitable stage of proto-science where different specialists are sorting out different ways of modeling the same phenomenon.
Well, the model that he wait, just 1 second, then just 20 seconds. Two items. The model that he discusses, the structural demographics theory, it mentions that it makes no assumptions regarding generations. It does not use a generational structure. And then
nor do I in the paper that I'm posting here.
What he says is his modeling, this is what he said, that his modeling experience says that it would take, quote, heroic assumptions to get the pattern assumed by SHGT, which is the generations theory, if it's even possible. So I'm not sure. Like if we were able to bring Turchin on here
playing
and
a little
ask,
fast and loose and kind of unfair. There is plenty of metricable modeling and lawful regularities done by Howe and Strauss in a rather amateurish way. And if all of he's saying is, yeah, that's amateurish, yeah, they were amateurs, no argument.
I'm just saying
these
this
are
is the
perfectly
guy
legitimate sort of,
seems to have,
things back and forth among different specialties in the social sciences. It'll even out.
Yeah, that's it. That's it.
All right. Thank you, Jason. Thank you for doing that. And I did drop the links into the live chat. Thank you, Porpoise. Jake 4D for $5. Jake, thank you so much for your continued support. He says you cannot call something a proto-science and not a pseudoscience until history has proven efficacy. Until then, it's entirely unjustified. How would you differentiate between a proto-science and a pseudoscience?
This is all okay. So we need to refine a little bit of things. So if I repeat things I've said on previous shows, I apologize, but y'all asked for it. So a pseudoscience is something that on the surface is using vaguely scientific terminology in order to add plausibility to something that fundamentally isn't scientific at all. There's no math behind it. There's no clear formula. There's no precision. There's no clear standards of induction and all the sorts of things that we expect from any authentic science. So pseudoscience isn't really trying. It's only trying to make it look like it's trying. Proto-science happens all the time. Everything that we now call a fully legitimate science across the natural and social and life sciences was at some point a proto-science. What does it mean to be proto-science? Well, I've laid this out in other publications. So briefly, what philosophers of science have noticed, studying the intellectual history of the various sciences and how they came to become sciences, is what you need during a proto-science is you need the sorts of criteria that I was talking about at the beginning of the show. First of all, you need a genuinely inductive phase in order to honestly and objectively, not subjectively, not be the lone genius that finds this stuff, but objectively have a community of inquirers that can objectively get good data, good facts, good information in order to inductively and observationally study the phenomena in question. If you aren't even honestly doing that, you're never going to become scientific in any sense. You're going to remain, you won't even be pseudoscientific. You'll just be doing ideology or religion or something. So, so you need a strongly inductive phase, a field of proto-communities, of experts able to honestly and objectively observe and come to at least some sort of convergence on what is going on, what has been going on so far that calls for explanation. So that's one requirement of a proto-science, and of course it's sharpened up for any real science. Second thing, the second part is the modeling. Enthusiasts of the show may recall a show I did last month on philosophy of science, and there I talked about the abductive phase. That is to say, a model has to somehow plausibly be responsible for the patterns and trends that are on the surface already observed, and any proto-scientific field is going to have a variety of theories all competing with each other. We're kind of at that stage right now with scientific history. So there is no paradigm, there is no singular model. There are lots of competing models all trying to roughly do the same thing, and that's why eventually a sort of mega model will shake itself out and it'll become an authentic full science. But things are messy in the proto-scientific stage. There's no singular paradigm. There's not even an agreed upon standard for what would count as proving any of the models. They're all sort of searching for their own predictability. But the third requirement is there. There has to be predictability. That is to say, it has to be able to make responsible and fairly precise, surprising predictions. Of course, precision being proportionate to the kind of science. You're not going to get mathematical precision so much in a big social science, but at any rate, it ought to at least try. So those three things: responsible inductive phase, responsible abductive phase of explanatory modeling that then leads itself to predictability. Why do you need those three things? Well, the payoff is confirmations, right? You actually go and check out if the predictions, roughly more or less within error bars, turn out to be valid or not. This is Karl Popper's Falsificationism 101. This is Charles Peirce, the expert in philosophy of science on abduction. This is standard stuff straight out of philosophy of science. With due acknowledgement that this is the social sciences. This isn't going to be quite as mathematically precise as astronomy or anything like that. So that's what we want from a proto-science. Lots of proto-sciences just get caught in this purgatory, sometimes for centuries. And I mentioned how sociology, had to knock on the door for almost 2 centuries before it got finally admitted as a legitimate science. Psychology languished for a millennium from the medieval ages, trying to become a proto-science. It had to shake off a lot of theological assumptions. And then it was finally admitted, about 150 years ago. It was becoming authentically experimental and physiological. So proto-scientific phases can last a long time. Some of them fail. Some of them are just failed projects. We might be looking at one here. I doubt it, but that's okay. Time will tell. It's worth the effort because remember, don't make fun of proto-sciences. Science expands. That's the cradle. All the other sciences had to go through similarly messy, tough phases. So there's hope.
Interesting point. And like I said, well, I certainly find the elements that are based from the very first time when you came on and when you spoke about it, the elements based on how the generations interact with each other, and how that spurns the different cohorts into how it is they function and operate in society. That seemed to make a lot of sense to me. So, and I have certainly enjoyed that element of it. What I think I'm going to do is I'm going to start to wrap it up. I'd like to go a bit longer, but I'm reaching my limit, and we are going to have a full week of shows. This is our first week back. This is my 3rd time getting COVID, so I think I deserve, do not get a sub at Subway after the 4th or something like that. I honestly should. I don't know what it is, but I should get something other than sick again. This is what happened.
I'll mail you one.
You're
I think
helpful
you get a variable
as
type
always.
named after you.
Oh well, I could see.
There's Subways at like every major truck stop. So I'll just, next time I happen to pull into a Pilot or something, I'll order you up a real fancy sub, and I'll have them wrap it up, and I'll ship it out to you.
You're helpful as always. I'm sure the mayo will be nice and rancid by the time you. What were we gonna say? Jason?
I was just going to say I'm going to drop off because I think that I asked the questions I had, and Dr. Shook provided some good responses. So I just want to say thank Dr. Shook for thank you for being on here, and I thought it was very informative. And I'm going to check out Peter Turchin, and I appreciate that. And it was good to see everybody. So
good to see you again, Jason.
Thanks.
Been a while, and thank you so much for stopping by.
Yep. Thanks, Nick. Appreciate it. Love being on your show.
Oh, thank you. Love it. Love it when you stop by. So thank you so much, Jason, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a good rest of your week there.
Yep. Thank you.
All right. So I can just feel I'm having some difficulty breathing, and for someone who has to talk. My wife always says that's when she's like, I tell her how sick I am. She's like, yeah, whatever. I was like, I really feel sick. She's like, yeah, whatever. It's like, but as soon as I stop telling dad jokes, she's like, okay, let's call I'm not feeling that sick. Yeah, but she didn't tell a dad joke, so it's to the ER with you. So I feel it. My dad joke meter is plummeting. So I did want to give everybody who's here a shot to sort of wrap things up. I'm sorry, Commander McMillan, we didn't get a chance to chat with you very much. I hope though we're going to see you tomorrow to discuss Ukraine in depth, because there's a great deal to discuss there, and I'd like to thank Dr. Shook very much for coming on. I always appreciate it when he wants to talk about this. So thank you, Dr. Shook. But before we wrap up, I also wanted to make sure that we give everybody a chance to say something. So Jason said his good night. Sinister, was there anything that you wanted to add as we wrap things up?
I wish I could remember what sparked me to think he was getting data information messed up, and probably going back to college, it's getting to be final season, and there's been a lot of calculus problems since then, and I forgot what it was about.
Yeah, there was. I remember you mentioned it when he said it, and it was a while back. So I don't. My brain has moved on.
Anyway, be excellent to each other.
All right, thank you so much, Sinister. Thank you, Commander McMillan. So Shook has been obviously studying this for a very long time. I hope that this was at a minimum a refresher for you. And it was. I remember Dr. Shook had asked me to pass on his paper to you, and I passed it on, and I wasn't sure if you had even heard of it, and you were delighted. You said, "Oh yeah, let's do this." So I was a little. So is this something that you've followed up on? Is this something that you're going to continue to think about and study on, despite obviously a number of objections that have been raised? We've heard these objections before, and certainly the audience here has raised them. So what are your thoughts?
No, I found this very refreshing and enlightening. They talked about different viewpoints of how the generations system works and how people view it. Dr. Shook's interpretations don't entirely match my own, but are extremely similar. I think the big problem is people, when they say they want something that's predictive or like it's prophecy or something, I think Strauss and Howe would have really objected to those ideas. They were saying, we're just looking at this in retrospect and saying there appears to be a pattern. And based off of that pattern, here's what we think are likely things that may occur in the future. And I think too many people, when they want to see something predictive, they want to know that, IBM stock is going to hit exactly this amount on this time, on this date. And that's not what this is supposed to be about. It never was even remotely about that kind of prediction. It was general trends, general archetypes, why certain things develop into patterns that we see. And from that aspect, I've always found it extremely useful to view developments in the world through that prism.
Listen, when I agreed to have Dr. Shook on the first time, which I think was like at this point 2 years ago, it was solely based on the expectation that he was going to tell me what was going to happen with IBM stock, and he still hasn't done it. And I just can't even.
Should have asked me about Tesla instead.
I can't buy.
There you go.
I should have. All right. Well, thank you so much, Commander. I look forward to tomorrow. There's just a tremendous amount to catch up, and everybody in the Discord has been going up. And speaking of, and if somebody, Jake, if you happen to have it handy, I used to. Let's see. I had a Discord button here. It's disconnected, but come and join us on the Discord. There's usually an after show. I probably won't be able to make the after show today. I'm gonna have to rest the lungs, but we've been keeping up with Ukraine a lot. We're gonna go back to our regular shows. I think Ukraine is back to needing more than once a week, so we're gonna be covering Ukraine pretty frequently. We're also gonna try not to let slide any number of things, including Marjorie Taylor Greene and her shenanigans going on, as well as U.S. Supreme Court. A couple of interesting decisions. We'll be covering all that. But tomorrow it's going to be exclusively Ukraine. The next day, assuming as Andrew and I are both up for it, we will be talking about some interesting takes that John Oliver had on the trucking industry. One of the things that John Oliver in his recent show on the trucking industry, one of the things that he had mentioned and we've talked about on occasion, and something I really did not understand until I started speaking with Xandring, was just how dependent we are on that. And we spoke a little bit about it during our show on logistics, but I'm looking forward to that show. So that is scheduled for Thursday, if Xandring and I are both up for it. I'm cautiously optimistic. And then
more logistics.
More logistics, exactly. Everybody's favorite topic. when you want to talk philosophy, logistics, this is In Time is the show to. So it's going to be a good show. It's going to be a good show.
Hey,
so,
Nick, can I give
yeah,
two more shout outs?
Oh yeah, I'm gonna give you the last word. I'm gonna give you the last word. Can you? Do you want to?
Oh wait.
Definitely going to give you the last word. So, anyways, come join us on the Discord. Find out what's going on with Ukraine, future shows, and but we have just bleeding edge. What's going on in Ukraine is being covered in our Discord. So I hope you'll join us. Jackalope. Herdmaster 199 got a sticker. Thank you so much for your support. We really do appreciate it. It's one of the few shows we've actually done that probably isn't going to get demonetized. Every other one is. So your support is really greatly appreciated. Thank you so much. Was there anything, any last words you had, Andrew, before we bailed? Any last things that I forgot, or anything you wanted to bring up before we go?
Two quick things. One, in regards to generation theory, it sounds very interesting. It's piqued my interest. So I will see if I can find the book on audio, hopefully, at least the first one. I'll see what's available out there to read up a little bit more about it. So thanks for coming on and explaining it a bit more. And second thing is, one of the things I wanted to add about the show of trucking is it's not just about logistics, but it also is a bit of a commentary on shows that are trying to inform the American population. You know, John Oliver is a very entertaining person. I love watching his show. I've not agreed with him on many occasions, but I still enjoy the show. So when it comes to a topic where he's going to start talking about something that I know very well, I'm curious as to how accurately he does it. You know, how much glossing over is he doing, or how much nuance is he putting in there, etc. Because I want to know how, you know, accurate a portrayal he's giving of the issues in the situation, because he talks about a lot of topics that I don't have a very good understanding of. So it's really good to be able to contrast areas where I am an expert in and can evaluate how good a job he does and get an idea of the accuracy of some of the other or potential problems, some of his other segments where I don't know a lot about it. You know, so I think it's really good to be able to look at very popular shows like that, to be able to figure out, you know, just how accurate are they.
I think that's a great point. I think In Time is nothing if not dissecting what we see in media. I think that's one of the things that I enjoy most. So I'm very much looking forward to that show. So that's, I think, ostensibly we're going to do that on Thursday. Because I always ask the same question, right? Which is like, you know, he talks about all of these things. He sounds like he knows what he's talking about, but of course he's not an expert. So it's always, and I've got my own couple of stories, but I'm a huge John Oliver fan. I know you are too. So I look forward to that. And lastly, Dr. 𝐂𝐤𝐧, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate you coming by, as always. It's always a delight. And as Andrew, every single time you come on, the first thing as Andrew does is comment on just how many books you've got back there. Andrew is in awe of your collection. Any final thoughts before we go on the show, on the topic tonight, or anything else that you wanted to hit on before we bail?
Just two more shout outs for curious folks who want to follow up. Number one, this is the book we've been talking about, Generations. It can be found paperback, audiobook. The other book you got to read, chock full of even more predictions. The Fourth Turning is the name of that book. Again, easily acquired in paperback. There is a website that the authors constructed that's even bigger than all their books combined with so much information. Go to fourthturning.com, just strung together, fourthturning.com. And you can learn everything that's in the books and so much more besides. Also, if you go to YouTube, type in one of the authors' names. Now, Bill Strauss died a few years back, but the other fella is alive and here in the DC area. Maybe we should get him on. But he's on everybody's shows lately. Everybody's talking about World War III. They have Neil Howe on. So if you go to YouTube, type in Neil Howe, and look for some of the recent interviews that he's been doing over the past couple of years. Very informative, and of course, it's his paradigm, so no one explains it quite like Neil. He's absolutely terrific. Finally, one last prophecy. I'm going to enter prophecy mode, and I'm allowed to do that because I'm a philosopher, and that's kind of our kinship over in that direction. Look, Howe and Strauss would say, as they said in Generations, if this prediction of a secular crisis comes true, in the 2020s. That is the best possible news for America. Why? Because every time America, or going back in time as I did England, that they went through one of these very traumatic, very costly secular crises, we came out okay after it. The government stood, the civilization stood, the nation stood, and so forth and so on. The right generational constellation was in place. If this war had started even just 5, much less 10 years earlier, couldn't predict a good outcome because the generations wouldn't be in their life cycle roles, ready, willing, and able to do the particular jobs that they do. What jobs? We'll read the books. But basically, when you have a constellation of boomer-type elders, Xer-type sort of middle age, mid-career at the height of their institutional powers, and a rising young adulthood of GI-like, get her done, fall in line, civic-oriented generation ready to go. Only good things happen for America. So the prophecy is by 2028, 2030 at the latest, the smoke will have cleared. America will have been victorious over whatever is going on globally, that we have to wait for the headlines. But America will be victorious and enter into a new age of prosperity and a new global order that America will lead. By no means is there any need for dire prophecy unless our nation's leaders at each of the generational stages somehow fails, somehow lets us down, fails to fulfill its generational archetype responsibilities. And that can happen. Tragedy is always on the table. But it is happening at the right time, at the right life cycle location. So the reasonable prediction is to predict victory. And that can be reassuring.
Well, yeah, I do think that's reassuring. That just seems kind of counter to what we do here on End Time. I just, we tend to end on this really depressing, like it's all.
Well, bring me back in 6 years and do a retrospective.
I don't think I want to stand.
I can depress it down a little bit here if you want.
I'm not sure I want that.
Unless, of course, you're one of those casualties. I mean, the casualties don't particularly care at that point that they won or not because they have nothing else to worry about.
Well done, Xander. Yep, you did it. You did it. Congratulations. Well done. Thank you. All right. Thank you once again to everybody who came in. Thank you for the super chats. Thank you also, and I did want to mention the sticker. I think we did. Jackalope Herdmaster. Thank you so much for the sticker. Thank you, Porpoise, Jake, for the super chats. Thank you, Porpoise, also for coming on. We always love having you on. Thank you, Jason, Commander McMillan, Xandering, and I was going to say Captain John Shook. Wow, I think we're ending this at exactly the right time. Dr. John Shook, thank you so much for coming, and we will see you all tomorrow overtime as we discuss Ukraine. Have a marvelous evening. Thank you all for joining us.